Linda here. I wanted to share a quick technique with you on how to create a metal looking object out of nothing more than regular chipboard, which is a paper product. So let's get started. So I die cut this shape using a Tim Holtz Alterations die on my Vagabond. So I just use regular scrap leftover chipboard, and I'm going to use our Piccolo embossing powder adhesive mixed with our vintage copper embossing powder. Now, to start with, we never want to shake our jars of embossing powder. We always just recommend rolling it, because if you shake it, sometimes the heavy and the light particles will separate. So if you roll it, we tend to get a really nice blend to use. So I'm going to prep that by rolling my powder and removing the lid. And I'm going to use my Piccolo embossing powder adhesive, which comes in the dabber top. I really like this, really easy to use. So I'm just simply going to tap this around. What this is doing is laying a layer of ink on here to hold my embossing powder in place. So I just lay that on a scrap piece of office paper, tip out my embossing powder. Now, because our embossing powder, the vintage copper, has large granules mixed with fine granules, I don't want to tap this off. If I tap it, some of my larger particles might come off, and I really want those on there for the look I'm trying to create. So I'm just going to use a crease in my paper to funnel the extra back into the jar. I'm going to cap that and roll that again, because we're going to use a couple of layers on here. So we're going to start by heating this up. Now I'm going to be doing what I call a flash heat technique, and in order to do that and achieve the look I want, I usually like to melt my first layer pretty smooth. So I'm just going to heat this up. I'm using the Ranger Heat It tool. It's my heat gun of preference. I love it because it gets as hot as the other guns on the market. However, it tends not to blow, so it's not going to blow my powder off like some guns will do. So you can see I'm just going around, and as each area heats up, it's melting the embossing powder. You can see the different shades in our jars of embossing powder. So I don't need to use 2 or 3 different colors of embossing powder to achieve the look of an aged and rustic metal piece. I get all of that texture and color from the one bottle. Okay, so you can see I've got the first layer done here. And what I did is I melted it as smooth as possible. Some of the larger chunks will stay a little bit chunky. But I want to add another coat. Now on my second coat, I'm not going to melt it all the way. I'm going to leave some chunky little areas in there. So again, I'm going to prep my embossing powder first by rolling the jar and uncapping it. And then I'm going to put the embossing powder adhesive over top again, just like we did the first time. And I'm going to place that back on my scrap office paper. And again, just lightly sprinkle the embossing powder out. And again, I'm not going to tap it. I just gently roll it over because I want those large chunks to remain on my piece. So we're going to funnel this back into the jar and cap it. You always want to cap your embossing powder before turning on your heat gun. So now I'm going to use my heat gun, and I'm going to watch this closely as I work, and when I see the edges begin to melt, I'm just going to gently move it on to a new location on the piece. So this will help melt some of the powders, but not all of it. The powders underneath are warming back up, and so the top layer will actually sink down into that bottom layer, and it helps hold it in place. And this should be good. We're going to let it sit here for just a second and cool down. Remember, our powders have a mixture of ultra thick and fine grain particles in there. So I've built up 2 layers here, so this is going to take a little bit of time to cool down. And you can see where some of it is falling off. So that what that means is I didn't melt it far enough. So I'm just going to bring my heat gun back in there, and we'll just go over this area just slightly. See if I can get some more of that melted. And this is just where experience comes into play. You just have to practice with this technique, and eventually you'll learn what it looks like when it's held in place. So I'm going to let this cool a little bit, and then we'll test it again. So that's what I do. I just go along, I heat a little bit, I test it, let it cool. If it doesn't, there we go. We've got it set this time. So you can see the green patina in there, the bits of flakes and chunks, which gives it that aged rustic look. And you can see how it's been used on a canvas here as a little book plate. Very easy to achieve the metallic look using nothing more than paper products. Hope you enjoyed that little video. Again, this is embossing powder, the vintage copper embossing powder by Globecraft and Piccolo, and our Piccolo embossing powder adhesive.